Max Alvarez. Max?
Thank you so much, Laurie, and good afternoon, friends and supporters of New Plaza Cinema. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about a remarkable film from 1962, celebrating its 60th anniversary today, and an amazing year of 1962 that we're going to talk more about, and that's Stanley Kubrick's Lolita. This was Kubrick's sixth feature film. He was 34 years old when it came out. The Bronx-born director who had just scored a big commercial success with Spartacus 2 years earlier. It was a film for which he had been a director for hire. It was not a positive production experience for him, and in fact led to him demanding full editing control moving forward of his work. And Lolita, which clocks in at a little over 2.5 hours, was Kubrick's first Hollywood studio production in which he was granted full editorial and creative control. This sixth Stanley Kubrick feature was based on the ninth novel from the great Russian-born novelist Vladimir Nabokov, which came out to great controversy, acclaim, and success in 1955. When I first saw Stanley Kubrick's Lolita, it was at a Milwaukee Revival Theater in the late 1970s. I had just finished reading the Nabokov novel, and I found myself very irritated with this lengthy Kubrick film adaptation. While I had anticipated serious censorship compromises due to the Hollywood Production Code restrictions of 1962, I was annoyed that the intense drama of lecherous academic Humbert Humbert and Lolita Hayes, the underage object of his increasingly demented desire, was constantly being upstaged or diluted by the bizarre comic antics of Peter Sellers, whose role as Claire Quilty was hugely expanded for the film. These alterations didn't agree with me, and I found Lolita to be a very, very long and slow sit in the cinema. But please keep in mind that the film was being screened as part of a double feature which began earlier that evening with Tony Richardson's The Loved One. So you could say I was a bit fatigued when the MGM Lion finally made his appearance at the start of Lolita. Needless to say, my recent rescreening of the film was a radically different experience. I say without shame or hesitation that Stanley Kubrick's 1962 film is to cinema what Vladimir Nabokov's novel was to English literature, a masterpiece. A strange, disturbing, unsettling, often bleak, and frequently hilarious masterpiece. This dark, dark, dark comic skewering of American culture and mores, with its intellectual sociopath embarking on a self-destructive and sickly road to personal ruin, with his desirable stepdaughter of undisclosed adolescent age, demonstrates the kind of audacious cinematic risk-taking we would come to expect from the future director of Dr. Strangelove, 2001: A Space Odyssey, A Clockwork Orange, Barry Lyndon, The Shining, and Full Metal Jacket. And with strange irony, while Lolita is in many aspects a quintessential American narrative, even though its author was born in Russia, it was filmed almost entirely in England, a country which moving forward will serve as Stanley Kubrick's home and production base. MGM had blocked funds in England, which is why production took place there. One admirer of the Nabokov novel, Gregor von Retzori, who wrote about it in Vanity Fair back in the 80s, wrote that a line could be drawn between Lolita as a delightfully frivolous story on the verge of pornography and Lolita as a literary masterpiece, the only convincing love story of our century. And Britannica.com wrote that the novel examines love in the light of its seeming opposite, lechery. So to attempt to bring such a scandalous, wicked novel to the screen in 1962 was almost a revolutionary act of madness on the part of Stanley Kubrick and his producer, James Harris. But they did it. And here is how MGM taunted the public with this remarkably brisk and astute teaser trailer from 1962, backed appropriately by composer Nelson Riddle's droll Lolita Yaya. Welcome to New Plaza Cinema's Talkback Online.
Yeah. Lolita.
Lolita.
How did they ever make a movie of Lolita?
How did they ever...
A movie of
How did they ever...
How did they make a movie of Lolita?
Make a movie, make a
We're going to be talking about this remarkable film today with three distinguished gentlemen who I will be interviewing and introducing momentarily. Just a few more comments. Stanley Kubrick later said after Lolita came out, had I realized how severe the censorship limitations were going to be, I probably wouldn't have made the film. Well, I'm glad he did, because here is a film with remarkable performances, actors in many cases delivering what might be their finest work in film. Shelley Winters as the sex-starved widow who immediately sets her sights on Humbert Humbert. Kubrick rarely had prominent roles for women in his films, and Shelley Winters as Charlotte Hayes is one of the few significant female characters you're going to see in a Kubrick picture, which, given her superb rendering of the role, makes one wish the director had created more roles of this quality for actresses. We have young Sue Lyon, who was only 14 when she made the film, makes her screen debut as Lolita Hayes and delivers an equally outstanding performance of depth, range, humor, and power. A tough role to be springing on a very young girl, and one that's going to have, unfortunately, some long-lasting effects on the actress. And we have Peter Sellers, on the verge of major stardom as Inspector Clouseau and Dr. Strangelove. I've now come to fully embrace his Claire Quilty with his incredibly twisted monologues and ad-libbed asides. But for my money, it's James Mason's film. Far too little praise has been given to Mason's Humbert Humbert, a brilliant, devastating, naked, truly painful performance of torment, obsession, and ultimate madness. Easily the greatest and riskiest performance on screen by this marvelous British actor. Yes, Gregory Peck was excellent that same year in To Kill a Mockingbird, which won him an Academy Award. But I believe the trophy should have gone to James Mason, who didn't even rate a nomination. Basically, Mason and Kubrick forced the viewer into the uncomfortable position of feeling the suffering of this very troubled man, Humbert Humbert, as his destructive and equally self-destructive domination of young Lolita intensifies over the course of the 2.5-hour film. I'm reminded of literary critic Lionel Trilling, whose assessment of the character from the original novel went, Humbert is perfectly willing to say that he is a monster. We find ourselves less and less eager to agree with him. And in James Mason's performance, it truly is a pathetic figure by the end as he's breaking down in tears, clearly in love with this young girl and know that it's just his life is at an end. Although Nabokov was credited with the screenplay of Lolita, Stanley Kubrick and producer James Harris entirely rewrote the script. Nabokov remarked that, quote, only ragged odds and ends, quote, of his commissioned script made it in the film, and admitted that his initial reaction to seeing the movie was, quote, a mixture of aggravation, regret, and reluctant pleasure. Quite a few of the extraneous inventions struck me as appropriate and delightful. Others were painful. Most of the sequences were not really better than those I had so carefully composed for Kubrick. Adrian Lyne, who directed the 1997 remake of Lolita, felt that Nabokov's script was awful. Others, however, disagree, and I will have one example later on of a scene that Nabokov had written that was changed for the film. Nabokov described Kubrick's film as a scenic drive as perceived by the horizontal passenger of an ambulance. We have different views on the film, of course, but I'm very pleased at this point to be introducing two outstanding guests who have authored a book that came out last year, Cinema 62, The Greatest Year at the Movies, which chronicles Hollywood's exploits, primarily Hollywood's exploits in 1962, when films such as Lolita were being greenlit by studios in a year that took adult drama very, very seriously. Joining us today are Stephen Farber, who teaches film history and criticism. We have somebody's audio on, and we're going to work on muting that. We have Stephen Farber, who has been teaching film history and criticism in the graduate division of UCLA's School of Theater, Film and Television. He's written reviews and articles for The Hollywood Reporter, The New York Times, The Los Angeles Times, The Daily Beast, Movie Line's Hollywood Life, Esquire, New York, Harper's Bazaar, Film Comment, and so many other publications. In partnerships with Landmark Theaters, Farber has been host and producer of Reel Talk, REEL, a popular film series featuring screenings and discussions of new motion pictures. He's also been involved in producing segments for the A&E networks on stars such as Spencer Tracy and directors such as Roman Polanski. His co-writing partner in crime, Michael McClellan, is the former senior vice president and head film buyer for Landmark Theaters. He served on the Board of Appeals of the Classification and Ratings Administration of the MPAA, which means that if you were a filmmaker, you were having to face Michael McClellan and others when you were trying to get a rating approved or reviewed. And he currently co-produces a classic film series in Los Angeles. Stephen Farber and Michael McClellan, welcome to our talk back on Lolita, and congratulations again on this outstanding book, Cinema 62, which we urge every film lover to read.
Thank you very much for the plug, and very happy to be here.
Yes, I am indeed. And hello, everyone.
Gentlemen, I guess for starters, 1962, the novel Lolita comes out in 55. Suddenly in 1962, the film industry is ready for it. Any thoughts on what made that happen? Why 1962? Why not earlier?
Well, I don't know if they were quite ready for it, even in 62, but they certainly would not have been ready for it before then, just because of the controversy involving the novel. Things were loosening up a little bit with the censorship code by 1962. In fact, in 1961, late 1961, the code had been revised to allow homosexuality, and as they said in their announcement, other sexual aberrations to be included in films if handled in a discreet manner. So I think that paved the way for Lolita, as well as a number of other provocative movies that came out in 1962. But there still was a censorship office at that time, and the movie had to be submitted there. The script had to be submitted, the film, and it took many months before the film was finally approved. Not a lot had to be changed, but there was a lot of haggling over details. And finally, the film was approved, got a code seal. It was also approved by the Legion of Decency, the Catholic Censorship Office, after, again, lengthy negotiations and discussions with that group. So you ask why it hadn't been screened before that. It's amazing to me, even that it finally was approved in 1962, given the censorship that still existed and all the hoops that gifted filmmakers had to jump through to get their films on screen. But they did succeed in keeping a lot of the adult material from the novel and the screenplay. And I say, you can't imagine such a movie having been made and shown in America 2 years earlier. It would not have happened. So this was one of the things that made 1962 a breakthrough year, was that we were seeing challenging screen subjects handled for the first time. And this is one example of something that could not have been done earlier. And people criticized at the time that, oh, it wasn't faithful enough to the novel, that it wasn't as sexually explicit as the novel had been. It couldn't have been at that time. But the amazing thing was that it still made it clear that there was a sexual relationship going on between Humbert Humbert, the James Mason character, and his teenage stepdaughter. It probably helped that Sue Lyon looked a little bit older than 14, which is what she was when she started filming the movie. You know, people, their ages are fluid, and some people at 14 look a little older than other people. So it wasn't quite as shocking as the Adrian Lyne version from '97, which had an actress who was more looking like a 12 or 13-year-old rather than Sue Lyon looked more like a 15 or 16-year-old. Nonetheless, it was clear that they were having a sexual relationship that wasn't being hidden at all. It was very, I wouldn't say explicit, but it was frankly handled. And that was something that required in many cities, only people over 18 or over were allowed to be admitted to the theaters because of this shocking nature of the material. And that was something, I say, that we would not have seen even a couple of years before this.
And just to place everything in historical context, this was the twilight of the studio era. The golden age had long passed. The advent of television in the late 40s and all through the 50s seriously eroded the box office. Many theaters closed by the early 50s, and so there was a real challenge. Now, at the simultaneous in this era, in the early 60s, there was this tremendous influx of foreign films that flooded the nation's art houses, and those films had much looser restrictions on their content. There was more adult content. There was nudity and much more overt sexuality than you'd ever see in an American film. So the studios, which by this point released only a minority of self-produced films, the majority of films produced by the studios in this era were independent productions that they made financial arrangements with. And this is exactly what Lolita is. It was independently financed when Kubrick, director Kubrick, and his producing partner, James Harris, went to every studio. They were all turned away. It was too hot to handle for the studios at that time. So they produced it independently, and they filmed it in England for economic concerns, but also so they could not be under the constant scrutiny of both the production code and the Legion of Decency, which has been already described. So that's your setup for why the film was shot in England and why it was eventually picked up by MGM, but everyone else had passed on it.
So that's so interesting, Michael. In other words, MGM, it wasn't like a negative pickup where MGM said, look, we'll give you the money, you produce it, and then we will officially acquire it after it's done. They did an independent funding outside of MGM.
Seven Arts Productions, which also financed whatever happened to Baby Jane that year, because that film also couldn't get a studio backing for other reasons. But so yeah, that was fairly prevalent. And so that was the situation that they were facing. And so MGM finally agreed to release it, but only with a distribution deal. There was no financial risk to MGM, so they felt, and that's exactly what happened with Baby Jane that year. Jack L. Warner, he only made a distribution arrangement. He did not have any financial risk in the production.
That's very helpful information. Thank you. And Stephen, you were talking about the censorship issues, obviously with a story like Lolita. The information, I would love to have access to the the production code files in Los Angeles. So I imagine they must be massive and filled with documents on Lolita. The few information that I was able to track down, they're obviously, the censors did not want any allusions to a sexual intimacy between the two characters, but they do have that very bold close-up of Sue Lyon as after she's been whispering to Humbert's character as he's lying in the cot that's collapsed. She's standing or leaning over him, looking down, smiling, and the camera fades out on her face after she's been whispering things, which clearly indicates that something is going to be happening. What I discovered here was that in Nabokov's original screenplay, Nabokov had written that at that point, when Lolita and Humbert are in the hotel room at the Enchanted Hunters Hotel, the camera is supposed to travel into the rooms of other guests, some of whom hear Lolita's giggling of pleasure and think they are hearing a child at play. That gives us a sense of, at least a taste of what Nabokov was after when he did the writing of the script. We get a sense, especially in the scenes involving Peter Sellers, although also in some of the scenes between Humbert and Lolita, that Kubrick had encouraged improvisation. I don't know if they were technically doing improv while the camera was turning, because Kubrick did so many takes of things, of course, but I do get the sense that a lot of the dialogue was based on improvisation. We have Claire Quilty in the very first scene calling himself Spartacus, which obviously an in-joke to Kubrick's film. Did you get some of that feeling as well? And Dan will chime in on this shortly when we introduce him.
Well, I think you do get that sense, particularly in the Quilty Peter Sellers scenes. And if I could just go back to your point about the seduction scene in the hotel, where Lolita leans over Humbert in the cot and whispers in his ear, it's pretty obvious to anybody who has eyes what's going on in that scene. If I could just, this is actually something I do recall from the novel. The novel had actually, Humbert is a narrator of the novel. And at that point, he says, I think this is an approximate quote from the novel, that he says, surprisingly, dear reader, it was she who seduced me. And so that was an idea that came from the novel, that she was, although a young teenage girl, pretty knowing. She had been just attending Camp Climax, which is the name of the summer camp that she had gone to, that Humbert picks her up from that camp after Shelley Winters' death. And so she's pretty knowing in her sexual activities before that. The idea is that she was hardly a virgin even then. And so she was sharing with Humbert in that hotel room scene some of her games that she had been playing. You don't have to see anything more explicit to know what was going on. And I don't think you really have to have any subsequent bedroom scenes between the two of them, which of course wouldn't have been permitted under the production code. Just the one scene that happens later in the film, and that also is used over the titles, of Humbert painting Lolita's toenails, gives you a pretty good sense of the intimacy between them without anything that a censor could point to and say, oh, this is graphic sexuality. It didn't have to be, because you knew that if they were sharing that kind of an intimate moment, they had a lot of other history between the two of them by that point. So I'm sorry, I forget, what was your other question?
No, that's very, very well stated. And there were, it's been so many years since I read the novel, but Nabokov, the novel was known for these long passages by Humbert where he's describing these crazy sights of rural America as he and Lolita are doing their 27,000-mile drive around the country, these strange stores and shops and things of that nature. One of them that made it into the film, which Kubrick for some reason kind of threw away, was the Enchanted Hunters Hotel. I was expecting a sign announcing it at the beginning of the scene, but you have to look in the background. There's a banner where the Enchanted Hunters Hotel welcomes the police convention. And then there's another subtle point. The play that Lolita appears in at high school, once they're in Ohio, by Claire Quilty, is called The Hunted Enchantress. And that was very underplayed. I don't recall whether a shop that Lolita and her friends hung out at for malts, the Frigid Queen, appeared in the Nabokov novel, but certainly it does in the film when Mason's character is in this paranoid state about what is she doing when she leaves school before she comes home. There are some characters I know we have later on at the hospital, a Miss From kiss that was invented for the film. I'm thinking maybe the character Mr. Swine, who was the sleazy night manager at the Enchanted Hunters, may also have been invented for the film. So there were elements there that they were at least trying to capture some of the spirit of this insane slice of Americana that Nabokov was capturing.
Right. I mean, one thing that had to be underplayed in the movie, since it was not actually filmed in the United States, it was filmed in England. So you do miss some of those bizarre touches that the author had put into the novel. You have to remember, Nabokov was an emigre, and he was fascinated by America. He, as sometimes only an outsider can be. So he loved all these little touches, the motels, the roadside diners, the ice cream parlors, and they could only retain some of that in the movie because it was not filmed on the locations that were described in the novel. But the humor is certainly still there in sort of capturing the American idiosyncrasies and Peter Sellers in the different characters that he plays.
Yeah, I think there were two people in that too. Hold on. Okay, that's
somebody's audio that's on that we're going to need to turn off. Go right ahead.
I got it, Max.
Terrific.
Peter Sellers does capture a lot of the humor that is in the novel. He really, it's there in other parts of the movie too. Shelley Winter certainly captures a lot of the humor that was written in the novel. And Sellers, in the scene at the hotel that is the seduction of Lolita by Humbert, or vice versa, of Humbert by Lolita, there's a brilliant scene where Humbert is downstairs outside while Lolita is going to sleep. He's waiting for this cot to be delivered, and he's approached by a policeman staying at the hotel, played by Sellers, although under a different name and a different identity, who kind of quizzes him about who was this beautiful young girl that I noticed. I couldn't help noticing that you had traveling with you. And Humbert, oh, that's my daughter. And Sellers, as this a policeman, keeps probing more intrusively into who is this, and do you have a nice enough room? Because I know the manager, and we can get you something. And I know that you and I are both normal people, but he's implying that you're doing something that's not at all normal, and I know about it. All of that, I think, partially was improvised by Sellers, but it brilliantly captures this sort of byplay between these two characters, Humbert and Claire Quilty. And Quilty always has the upper hand, always has the advantage over Humbert. the child molester, Quilty, as we will learn, also has some kind of a history with Lolita too, but he, just the power dynamic between the two of them in the different scenes that they have together is brilliantly written and acted by both Sellers and James Mason. Superb sort of pas de deux between the two of them. You couldn't really imagine these scenes without either one of them. It's a brilliant acting. And as you mentioned at the beginning, the role of Quilty is built up quite a bit from what it was in the novel, partly to give Sellers these opportunities. And he wasn't a big star at this time, but this was one of the movies that helped to really put him in everybody's consciousness. And a year or two later, he had become a gigantic star. But this was one of the first movies that really illustrated the comic genius that he had, because he plays so many different characters really with the same name, but through the course of the movie.
Just a quick side note to that.
Please.
Sellers made such an impression that at Oscar time, which you had mentioned, Max, that you felt Mr. Mason should have been nominated, and you're correct, he should have been. It was an incredibly competitive year, the most competitive year of the 60s, basically in all categories. And so the Academy, when they submitted Sellers in supporting actor, the Academy said, no, he should be in the Best Actor race, because he had made that much, even though he has less screen time, he made that much of an impression to the committee. And so they insisted on him being in the Best Actor race, whereas MGM had put him in the Best Supporting Actor category.
Great piece of information right there. Which brings us to the look of the film, and that brings us to Dan Cahill, our filmmaker and cinematography expert. Dan, we're eager to hear what you have to say about the look of Lolita, and cinematography and Kubrick run hand in hand. Do share your thoughts.
I will, gentlemen. Good to see you all. I need to just make a few adjustments here, and we will plunge right into Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins. And as I often do with any of my presentations on the look of the film, I'm going to begin by discussing this gentleman, Oswald Morris, who was the cinematographer on the film, a very highly respected Brit who has 58 feature films to his credit. And it's interesting to note that 8 or 9 of them were done for John Huston. He shot The Man Who Would Be King, Heaven Knows Mr. Allison, and as a pioneering innovator with Huston, his work on the earlier films, the first version of Moulin Rouge and Moby Dick, featured a lot of experimentation with the color, which Technicolor did not especially like, and there was a lot of controversy over that. But Mr. Morris, based on his collaboration with Huston, very cleverly titled his memoir, Huston, We Have a Problem. And in it, the chapter on Lolita does not have a single complimentary word for Stanley Kubrick. In fact, he references his legendary reclusiveness and total inability to communicate. So let's see how this collaboration looks. Now, at the beginning, it's smashing. This is the prologue where Humbert comes to murder Quilty. And the opening shot of that is Humbert entering on the far right side of the frame there. The set design is impeccable. The lighting is stunning. And so are the camera angles. And it's now that we start to remember, oh yeah, Kubrick did a film noir with The Killing, one of his first films. And we're seeing traces of that here. Here is another shot of Quilty begging. And then he retires behind the painting where he is very cleverly shot through the face and the neck. This is Kubrick doing really good work. I also like this iconic shot, and it is helped substantially by Morris's top lighting. But I think what really seals the deal here is the hat. Without the hat, she would just be an ordinary girl in a bikini, but this becomes iconic, that and the sunglasses as well. Kubrick had a real eye for visuals. He was an experienced still photographer before he made a movie. And I love this 3-shot composition with Charlotte Hayes, Humbert, and, oh yes, a pistol. Now, I would note, and this is one of the themes of my presentation here, is that the lighting is kind of ordinary. It's very prosaic. There is, as in this scene, oh, sorry, no, I'm jumping ahead. Let's stick with some of the visual expressiveness here. This shot tells you everything you need to know, hands only. And I guess when you're terrified by the Curse of Frankenstein, you want to grab somebody. And here it tells the story. Now we are on the tour of Charlotte's house. And I just want to read a couple of sentences from Morris's memoir. A house was built to scale on the set. It did not have a front, but the hall was prized open to allow the large crane to zoom in and track along the hall and up the stairs into the various bedrooms. So this was all a construct just to make life easier for Kubrick and Morris. And once again, I'm going to note how dull the lighting is. There's nothing exceptional going on here. And part of this is very strategic. When you have a lurid, sensational subject matter, you kind of want the environment to be a lot less lurid. And that's what they were going for here. But I can understand the fact that it appears that Kubrick did not use Mr. Morris's talents to very good measure. Here again, we have sort of prosaic lighting, nothing too interesting. We don't learn anything about the characters from the way they are lit, sometimes the way they are composed in the frame, but here, nothing much. The acting, of course, is wonderful. I'll have a couple of more words about James Mason later, but here they are driving through the country. And Morris said he had nothing to do with the filming of the rear projection. And that is probably because that all had to be filmed in America. And they probably, I'm imagining the studio sent a second unit out to capture this stuff. Here we are in the penultimate scene of the film. Once again, the set design does more than the photography. This says blue collar, lower middle class life in America. And that is apparently where Lolita's future lies. Just a word about the humor in the film. I get the satire, and I think most of it is brilliant and reflective of Nabokov. But this I think of as the nadir of the film. When a director and writer are a little desperate for what to do next, that's when they go into America's Funniest Home Videos territory. The idea of somebody simply falling down lost its humor value for me when I was, about 4 years old. Other people may love it, but I just think this is not a good moment in the film. My last frame here, I just want to say something about the lady in the nurse's outfit. That is the very famous now, Lois Maxwell, who came to fame playing Miss Moneypenny in the early James Bond films, who was the secretary to M. And with that, gentlemen, I will tip it back to all of us.
Thank you so much, Dan. And we'll definitely be interesting to hear Stephen and Michael's thoughts on that. A couple of things. Thank you. That was really fascinating, especially on Oswald Morris's background. I was noticing there's that scene at night where Lolita goes to a payphone to make a call and Humbert tracks her down. They're outside of a service station. And that's when she says to him that she's perfectly fine leaving with him and leaving school. That appears to be a set. It looks like it was almost constructed inside a sound stage. I just thought that was an interesting art direction little tidbit there. And there also appears to be a Kubrick in-joke in Claire Quilty's character. After we see Lolita in that school play that Quilty has written, we see Quilty with a camera and he's calling on this silent woman, a partner of his, to get him some Kodachrome. Kubrick looked very much like that at the time. That was very much of a Kubrick appearance, clearly self-referencing in joke. I just wanted to mention that.
My impression is that throughout his career, Kubrick was much more comfortable on a studio set than he was out in the real world, where he didn't have as much control. And being the control freak that he was, I'm sure he took every opportunity to build something in a studio rather than go out and find a phone booth that looked American. So,
and another thing that stood out for me, even from the first time I saw it so long ago, was there were a lot of Kubrickian long takes. I mean, the first scene, for example, in Quilty's mansion, and gentlemen, correct me if I'm wrong, but I was under the impression that was supposed to end the film. And it was during the editing process that Kubrick decided to move that to the beginning, where Quilty gets killed.
Well, that's the way it
Is that true?
Was in the novel. And that was a big change to the film version. If I could just expand on a couple of the shots that Dan had spoken about and give a little more insight into what made the film so stimulating. You showed the scene with the pistol when Charlotte, Shelley Winters, and James Mason Humbert are in bed, and there's a pistol also in the frame. He's contemplating maybe killing her. They have gotten married at this point, even though Humbert has no love for Charlotte, but it's a way for him to get closer to Lolita. And so he decides to do that. What you maybe don't remember seeing in that shot is that on the far right side, there's a little bedside table with a photograph of Lolita, Sue Lyon, and Humbert and Charlotte. It's a bedroom scene between them where they're having sex, basically, or starting to have sex. And Charlotte is, of course, very ravenous sexually, Humbert much less so, but he's trying to get himself aroused by looking at the photograph of Lolita on the table, which is a humorous moment. Watching the film now, that's one of the a very wickedly comic touches in the movie. That also was something that led to a great deal of censorship concern, because when the movie was submitted to the Catholic Legion of Decency, the Monsignor Little, who was the head priest in charge of the Legion, objected very strongly to that scene, because he said, this is perverted. You're suggesting that a man can only get sexually aroused by his wife by looking at this photograph of his stepdaughter. And that is really like violates all of our ethical moral principles. And so they cut it down a little. They had fewer shots of the photograph in close-up and finally got the scene approved. But it was just one of the very wicked and biting touches that were very uncharacteristic of movies of 1962 that made it into the movie and contributed to the dark humor and satire in this film. Brilliant. But then I want to go to another shot that you showed in the hospital with Miss Moneypenny, Lois Maxwell, which is a scene much later in the film when it's become less comic and more dramatic and tragic. And as you said, Kubrick's compositions in general were not that brilliant in the film compared to some of the later movies that he did, which were so striking visually. But the end of that hospital sequence, when Humbert comes back that evening to see Lolita after he gets a threatening phone call from Quilty, and he gets concerned and he goes back to the hospital and finds that Lolita is not there and that she has been taken out by her so-called uncle. And Humbert sort of freaks out, goes crazy because no one tells him where she's gone, and he fears, rightly so, that he may lose her forever. And that is a very the way that sequence is shot when the doctors and the orderlies, he's going crazy, and the orderlies and the doctors swarm on him and threaten to put him in a straitjacket. And that's, I think, one of the greatest images in the film, showing that kind of how he's being intimidated and really physically restrained by the staff in the hospital. You feel his agony, his helplessness. He finally has to pretend that he knows the uncle who has picked her up so that they won't put him in like a mental institution. But it's a very effective scene from the way that it's shot, and Mason's performance is superb, just capturing the helplessness and his sense that he may have lost Lolita forever. It's at that moment that you realize, as you do in the final scene, which is coming up afterwards, that he really is deeply in love with her. It's not just a perverted, lustful attraction, which you might have thought at the beginning, but he really needs her in an emotional as well as a physical sense. And the fact that he has lost her, as we see in that hospital scene, is very powerful, partly because of the acting of James Mason, and I think also because of the shooting of the scene by Kubrick and Oswald Morris, one of the highlights of the film from a visual standpoint, in my view.
And then you also have those spectacular misty shots, the point of view of a car going through the countryside as he's heading to the Quilty mansion, that kind of elevated to a new level too.
Just a comment about Kubrick's use of long takes.
Yeah, please.
From Morris's book, he talks about, and I don't honestly remember which scene it was, but one particular scene that he did, I don't know, 20 some takes of. And he filmed no extra coverage or cutaways. And at one point, Morris tells him, well, Stanley, you know, oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself. Kubrick was consulting with the editor saying, well, on take 3, I like this part, and take 7, let's do that part at the end. And Morris had to go up to him and say, you know, you can't just arbitrarily cut between various portions of these long takes without some other shot, a cutaway, to cut to while you make that edit. And apparently Kubrick just ignored him and said something like, well, you and I should go on the BBC, meaning that we'll have an official debate about it. Now get lost. So that was part of the personality conflict on the set, ongoing.
Because there are, I'm sorry, I want to go ahead, Michael, please.
Yeah, it's just a quick one to Dan. Does Oswald indicate why the film was shot in black and white? Was it an economic or an aesthetic choice?
No mention.
Interesting, because this in 1962, the majority of films were in black and white. I mean,
Right.
It was a black and white world. Color was definitely there, was used for the big spectacles and the musicals and certain films, action films, but the majority of films were shot in black and white, and that was very much an economic and an aesthetic choice. So that's why I asked that.
Yeah, well, Mockingbird was in black and white that year. So
there are so many great films from '62 in black and white.
yeah.
Read the book, folks, and then you find out.
We will.
But black and white can make things look incredibly beautiful or incredibly depressing. And I think in Lolita, there are these passages, and my wife, we were watching it the other night, she was commenting on the bleakness, the visual bleakness of the film, that she feels that color could not have captured as effectively as black and white did, especially as the narrative unfolds. It seems to get bleaker and bleaker visually in that sense.
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly.
I think
It's remarkable to think. I mean, I was under the impression from a Kubrick biography that Kubrick pursued this project for commercial reasons. He was looking for a commercial property. And this film was commercially very successful, which is amazing considering what a downer it is. This is not a happy experience towards the end, but it did very, very well, obviously because of the controversy and the literary credentials that it brought to the project.
I noticed, if I could just say, someone had sent in a question that about the subject matter of the film being about a pedophilia and incest in effect, and how shocking, this is probably more shocking today even than it was at that time. And that's why the 1997 film had such a problem even getting any theatrical distribution at all. By that time, 35 years later, people were much more sensitive about those issues. Not that they weren't sensitive about it in 62, they certainly were, but the book was regarded as a great masterpiece. And so people were willing to see it as long as it didn't have overly disturbing images. But many people probably today, I don't many, but some people would not watch the movie just because they disapprove of the subject. And I understand that, but I think unfortunately they're missing some brilliant acting and writing and some of the most original humor that's ever been seen in any American movie. So you may gain certain things by forbidding the movie to be shown, but you also are losing things, and that's the complexity of art, in my view.
And that's brilliantly stated, and I would argue that you don't have to condone the behavior of characters in a fictional narrative. I mean,
Right.
I do not condone violence, yet I do enjoy Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. I don't condone what happens in that film, but that's the nature of art, and we have to, I think it's important that we challenge ourselves with difficult and uncomfortable themes. And this certainly is as difficult and uncomfortable as it can be from a narrative perspective.
I'd like to put in an extra word or two about one of my very favorite actors of all time, that being James Mason. And other people may be thinking, yeah, I wonder, I'd love to see some other Mason films. Well, I have a couple of titles to suggest. I'm going to skip over my personal favorite because I saw it when I was a boy, that being Captain Nemo in 20,000 Leagues. He's absolutely brilliant. But two other more obscure films. One is a Joseph Mankiewicz film from 1950, I believe, Five Fingers, which is a
52,
brilliant,
I think it was 1952, but yes, that was excellent.
a brilliant film, a sort of a classic in the espionage realm. And the other one is probably my very favorite performance of the character of Dr. Watson in the film Murder by Decree, which starred, I believe, Christopher Plummer was Holmes. And it's not a great film, it's okay, but Mason is just so understated and reassuring in his support of Holmes. It really moved me, so.
And that's a great recommendations. And of course, we have Mason in Carol Reed's amazing Odd Man Out from the late 40s, Max Ophuls' Caught from the late 40s. And he also was in Julius Caesar for Mankiewicz. And
As Brutus, yeah.
As Brutus, and he was Norman Maine in Cukor's A Star is Born. And then Shelley Winters, we have, I mean, just a fantastic performance here. She had grew up in Brooklyn, appeared on Broadway in the early 40s, and then heads to Hollywood in 43. She's going to be doing some interesting work for Cukor in A Double Life in the late 40s, and she'll appear several times in the 50s for George Stevens, A Place in the Sun. She's the victim of Montgomery Clift. She got her Academy Award, her first of two, for The Diary of Anne Frank, in a supporting role there. She's in films for Robert Wise, Executive Suite, Odds Against Tomorrow, Charles Lawton's Night of the Hunter. I mean, Aldrich's The Big Night. I mean, it's The Big Knife, rather, just these tremendous films in the 50s. And Sue Lyon, it was a short road of film, a short journey of films for her, but she went on to some very intense directors after Kubrick. 2 years later, she's in The Night of the Iguana for John Huston, And then 2 years after that, in John Ford's final feature, Seven Women. So she, that's a lot for a young lady to endure as an actress, to go from Kubrick and Huston and Ford in 4 very short years. I hemorrhage sympathy. And gentlemen, any comments on Peter Sellers at this stage in his career?
Well, one thing about him, as you mentioned before, he was very popular in the art house circuit. He had 2 or 3 hits. I'm All Right, Jack was one of them, and Waltz of the Toreadors was 1962 in the States. And also, just as a side note, he was in a hit summer studio comedy, the last of the Bob Hope, Bing Crosby Road pictures, The Road to Hong Kong, which wasn't all that funny, but he had the funniest scene. It was an unbilled little cameo. He played a doctor, a dentist working on Bob Hope, and the scene is hysterically funny. So if you want to look him up. And that, that helped introduce him to the States via that way. Of course, it was Lolita, and the rest goes on. Just a comment about all the performances. This film was, except for the screenplay by Nabokov, which is ironic because he really didn't write it. It was Harris and Kubrick. But they left his name on it deliberately because they wanted the prestige and they wanted to sell it as a prestige item. So they didn't take screen credit, either Harris or Kubrick, even though they wrote the vast majority of that script. He was nominated for an Oscar. It was the only nomination that the film got. Now, why didn't any other, as I said before, was incredibly competitive. But the interesting sidebar is that at the Golden Globes, the Hollywood foreign press, that's the key word, foreign, this film was heavily nominated. Best Director for Kubrick, Best Actor for a Drama for Mason, Best Actress for Shelley Winters, and Best Supporting Actor for Peter Sellers. And they recognized and actually gave an award to Most Promising Newcomer to Sue Lyon.
That's tremendous. Gentlemen, this is such a fascinating exchange. I know we do have questions and thoughts from our viewers, and we are going to open things up to questions and answer. I just want to do a little reminder tomorrow for those of you who live in the New York City area, and of course we're thrilled that people from around the country and overseas are participating, but for you New Yorkers, especially if you hang around the West Side, New Plaza Cinema's West End Theater on 86th Street, we're going to have a special event. We're having a screening with a Q&A at 2:20 tomorrow, Monday the 20th. We're going to be screening Terrence Davies' remarkable new film, Benediction, at 2:20 in the afternoon. And I will be joined by Gary Palmucci, my previous partner in crime here at the Talkback series. Gary and I, and perhaps some other people, will participate in a discussion about this phenomenal new film about the poet Siegfried Sassoon, a pacifist who wrote anti-war poetry after his terrible experiences in World War I, and then is dealing with his homosexuality during the Jazz Age. It's a stunning film, visually, superbly acted. It's lengthy. It's about 2 hours and 20 minutes, but Gary and I are still going to find a way to have a discussion afterwards. So if you go to newplazacinema.org, you can reserve a ticket to the screening tomorrow at 2:20 if you're in New York City. I just wanted to plug that. Thank you. And perhaps Lori or Marianne or whomever can assist us with questions from the audience.
Hi, everyone. I'm back. Kathleen Blanchard, if you could unmute and start your video. Hi.
Welcome back, Kathleen.
Welcome back. Good to see you again.
Oh, hi. How are you? It's funny. I can't see myself. So I wasn't sure if I was.
You look okay.
So
you're good.
I look okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very well.
Nice to see you all. Nice to meet the new gentleman. And I wish I was in New York to see you and Gary tomorrow. But anyway, in the chat, which I have been contributing to, I saw many references to different versions of Lolita, right? And then there's also mention of today's cancel culture. And I'm just curious to know, do you think that that a version of Lolita could be made today and shown in the theaters today, or is it just a subject that couldn't be touched? And I ask that also because we've had recent programs on the pre-code and the code films, right? Films before and after the code. So I have two questions. One is, do you think the film could be made today? And then the second question is, do you think we're actually existing under some sort of a culture code today? We may not have like a formal code as we had in the past, but do you think somehow today, at least in America, we're operating under some form of a culture code? Those are my questions.
Kathleen,
I would,
go ahead, Stephen.
I would answer first to the second question. Yes, we are operating on some kind of a culture code today. I think that prevents certain things from being shown or discussed. And to answer your first question, no, I do not think it would be likely that a film of Lolita would be approved to be made today. It would just send up too many red flags, and I don't know who would be willing to finance such a movie, what actors would be willing to star in such a movie, especially in the role of Humbert. I don't know who would play that now. So I don't think we would be likely to see it. And I understand the sensitivities that people have about the subject matter, but I do think that if you watch this movie, you're seeing some great writing and great acting, and I'm glad we are not deprived of at least watching this version of the film.
I would offer a somewhat cynical approach to the question, which is, when it comes to making movies, money drives just about everything. And in this case, I think it would be a question of the marketplace. And financiers of films would go, I don't think people want to see that these days. And so money would not be forthcoming to make it. That's my somewhat cynical view of how these things are put together.
I have a slightly different take on that. I agree in general, especially in the United States, no one would touch this film. Absolutely not. It's a red hot poker, but it might get international financing and be shot in Europe, just like the Kubrick version, for other reasons why it was shot there. But so I think, but yes, and also to answer your Catherine's other questions, Kathleen, sorry. Yes, I do think that we're operating under a de facto cultural code, not a formal one, but certainly an informal one now. Absolutely.
I mean, the term, I wish George Carlin was still alive to comment on this, because he was always specializing in constructing euphemisms. But the term cancel culture, I mean, cancel is a euphemism for censor. I mean, you don't censor things today, you cancel them. And we're seeing some of the greatest works of art under attack today. This is probably the most reactionary time in the nation's history that I can think of, where the arts have been under such attack for content.
If I could just tag on to the end of that,
Please.
Max, that it wasn't always like it was like that, and then it wasn't like that, and it seems like we've come to a time when it's, like I'm thinking Victorian, when everything was very proper, and then of course, one thing we haven't mentioned is the advent of the birth control pill in the loosening of social morals and sexual, loosening of sexual morals and mores in cinema, and of course, the code, but I think the pill had a lot to do with it.
Because that was the 60s.
The biggest fear before the pill was pregnancy, and now that fear wasn't there. And, the loosening of the code started in the early 60s. And of course, we have the Miracle decision in the mid to late 50s, which started, film as under the first.
That was in the 50s, actually.
Right.
1952, actually.
Yeah.
But I mean, you do have artists who are pre-censoring themselves, who are
Right.
afraid to go.
Oh,
into
yes,
certain
there's
areas.
no question about
And-
that.
and-
Absolutely.
That is very, very serious. And there's this general climate of fear that is affecting everyone from artists to programmers to distributors to exhibitors. Everyone
Yeah.
is afraid, and it's not healthy. It's
I
not
could
healthy.
point out as a coda to all of this, the birth control pill is under threat. Let's be honest. The right wing wants to eliminate birth control. It's on their agenda. It's popping up here and there. So don't be surprised when that enters the legislative domain.
We don't want to
Yeah,
get too
the
off
age of
topic. That's a
intolerance.
powerful
Yeah,
point.
don't
Yeah,
even get me started, Dan.
talking- yeah, Laura,
That's
you
a
started this.
wormhole
Thanks
I
a
could go
lot.
down for days. I think
course,
Kathleen and
of
I could
course.
both go down that hole for days.
It's a horror
yeah,
show.
yeah.
I
but
would
you
just
can't look the other
finalize
way.
Kathleen's question about, I do believe there is an unofficial code that people are being forced to operate under now. It's not as beautifully laid out as the production code of ethic was in 1930. Here was a document you could read. It would almost be easier if there was a document telling us these things. These are just spoken theories that are being passed around. No, we can't do that. And I believe there's a code.
Yeah, you only know when you've done something wrong, right? It's supposed to be in
Exactly,
writing.
exactly.
All right, thanks a
Thank
lot,
you,
guys.
Thank you,
Kathleen,
Kathleen.
thank you for all
You
your
all. Thank
comments.
you.
Very thought provoking.
Thank
Anne,
you.
could you unmute and start your video?
I'm going to
If
not.
anyone else has questions, Anne's is the last. So if anyone else has a question, raise your hand now or forever hold your peace.
I'm not going to start my video because
fine.
I haven't
Whatever
done.
you're comfortable with.
But I have two comments. The first is that sort of mundane thing. I thought that the production design was very interesting. The set decoration and design was very interesting because as Humbert gets more and more sucked into the relationship, the rooms become more chaotic. So the house that they live in Beardsley is like a mess. And of course, the end, there's this messy house with cigarette butts and bottles everywhere. So I thought that was a very interesting way of bringing out some of the mental things that are going on with the character through the way the sets were decorated.
It's visualizing the increasing mental instability of the character. That's powerfully stated.
Right. And I also loved the costuming for Shelley Winters with her leopard print, her leopard print belt and her leopard print top. And, she's supposed to be kind of cool in this town that's not very cool. Then kind of on the comments you were making just now, well, I don't find the content of this movie disturbing. I do worry about using very young actresses in this way. I mean, Sulain was what, 14?
14.
Very, very young. And, we've known that sets can be very damaging, to women. And also just after a movie like this comes out, the typecasting that can happen especially for a young girl, I think is, it causes pause. It creates a pause for me.
Can anyone speak to what her experience was and what happened to her after?
Well,
go ahead.
And I think your point about typecasting is very true because in one of the movies you mentioned, The Night of the Iguana, she played kind of a sex pot, sexually flirtatious girl who's making advances to the preacher, tour guide played by Richard Burton, and also to the bus driver. So yes, I mean, so she got cast in a particular type of role after Lolita, and she didn't, from what I understand, have a very happy life afterwards because of maybe indeed being thrust into an adult world at too early an age. So there definitely are consequences to people doing this. A lot of people wanted the part. A lot of parents wanted their daughters to be in the movie, and a lot of young girls felt it was a great opportunity. But they don't always think about what the long-term consequences will be, and I don't think they were that good for Sulain.
Because one of the theories that I don't often share, because it's pretty explosive, is that I believe putting a child in any kind of a film is not a good idea. I think that when we look at history, the impact on motion picture work for kids tends not to be healthy. So when you compound that with the theme of Lolita, I can just imagine the impact that would have. It's bad for boys as well as girls in films and this sort of work. But I can only imagine what it would have been like for Sue Lyon being stereotyped in that kind of character and dealing with all those other pressures.
Phil, did you have a question or something you wanted to say? No? Anne, you seem to keep raising your hand. Did you want to ask a question?
I thought I put my hand down, so.
You did, but I thought
Okay.
maybe you still had a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Phil. Go
Oh,
ahead.
good, good. Okay, I think we've just seen an example of cultural timidity in the discussion of the past 5 minutes. I mean, would you have a movie about Lolita? Would you have a movie about Lolita? Would you have a movie based on Lolita if you didn't have a young girl playing the part? And if you didn't have a young girl playing the part, you wouldn't have that story. I mean, you just have to accept that that's what's going to be going on. And as to whether kids should be cast in movies, you've just wiped out a lot of territory there.
I
A
know.
whole lot of territory.
But then I've read a lot of history too with actors.
The stories are endless, and they're almost always, not almost always, no, there are many that are very, very, very sad. You know, I'm sure we have a list in our head of 10, 15 child actors who met untimely and in many cases horrible ends. But that doesn't mean, you know, it's kind of, you still want to have those movies, you know, so it's either that, you either abhor movies with children in them, or you abhor movies that have the subject matter that Lolita did, or you don't. I mean, go ahead and make the movie. And I'm glad they did. I'm really glad they did, because I think, as you all believe, seem to agree, it's a very good movie.
One should note on the question of child actors that now there are many, many protections in place to make sure that the children are being educated during the shoot and not exploited in any way.
That's right.
That doesn't mean that they're not going to get damaged somehow by the experience, but now people are aware that kids need to be protected.
Yes, indeed.
And also, again, in historical context, 1962 has two of the best all-time child performances in the history of the medium. One of them, which won an Oscar, Patty Duke in The Miracle Worker, and Mary Badham in To Kill a Mockingbird. You can't top either one of those performances.
That's right.
So that's an open debate.
Different subject matter, though.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, right.
Well, my goodness, what a provocative discussion. This has been such a tremendous input from our viewers today. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, others. Does anyone have anything they'd like to add at all about the film or 1962 on film before we turn things over to Sean?
Max, it's Kathleen again.
Yes.
Do you mind I just jump in with a question about 1962? It is a remarkable lineup of all the films in 62. And why is this? Why is this? Why are we getting such a treasure trove of films from that particular year?
Well, that's what the book is all about. There are so many. Exactly. I mean, seriously. I mean, I could go on for an hour with you. I mean, it's all in the book.
Cinema 62.
Got it.
Thank you for bringing that up, though.
Thank you, Michaels. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you, everyone, for showing up on Father's Day and Juneteenth. And now, Sean?
Yeah.
Thank you all for having us.
Yes,
Thank you for
indeed.
coming.
You're always welcome.
Appreciate it.
What a great discussion once again, and I thank our audience for such great questions and being so honest about their questions, because I think these are things people wanted to discuss, and it's good to bring that to the forefront. So thank you very much. Coming up next in July, we have Paris on Film, which Max will be doing a lecture, and I think that's the 13th, Max. No, maybe I've got the.
I think you are correct. I'm double checking that. I believe it is Wednesday, Wednesday, the 13th is
The
correct.
13th of July. And then on Sunday, we're doing Beauty and the Beast, which is La Vie. How do we say that in French?
La Belle et la Bête.
La Belle et la Bête. And so that will be just a wonderful, wonderful discussion. Completely different than what we're talking about today.
If I could for 1 second, some people in the chat are asking where we could find their book. So if Stephen or Michael could speak to that.
Yeah, Michael, can you put that?
Yes, it's very easy, folks. Go to Rutgers University Press website, Rutgers University Press website. Look for, search for Cinema 62. When you go and you see it, put in, and you go to buy it, hopefully, put in the promo code section, all in caps.
Mr. Go bleed the streets. Ski.
R Cinema, and then the number is 62. R Cinema 62 promo code, and you'll get a 30% discount, and that comes direct from the publisher.
Okay. So what I will do for everyone is that I will take that information. Actually, I'm hoping that Stephen or someone can send me the information, and we can send an email out to everyone with that when we send out.
Okay, yes, I'll do that. Thank you.
We'll make sure everyone gets that information. Okay, so we'll see. We hope to see you in July talking about Paris. And thank you so much, everyone, for your participation today. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Have a great week, everyone. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.